Between Love and Crime. Chapter 1. Shadows of Childhood. The night was dense, laden with an oppressive silence interrupted only by Sofia's hurried footsteps. The 8-year-old girl ran aimlessly, her bare feet kicking up dust as her tears mixed with the dirt on her face. Her heart pounded in her chest, and fear drove her away from the horror she had witnessed just moments before. Her parents were dead. She had seen it all. The brutal voices, the sharp gunshots that echoed through the small house, and the bodies that fell like broken dolls. Her older brother had tried to protect her, but he was also taken by the men with cold eyes and calculated gestures. Little Sofia managed to escape through an opening in the kitchen wall and now ran through the dusty streets of Culiacan, searching for refuge, a place where those monsters couldn't find her. But they found her. Sofia was grabbed by firm arms and thrown into a truck. The engine roared as the vehicle sped down the highway, leaving behind what was once her home. Fear paralyzed her. The man beside her, with a thick beard and an icy stare, lit a cigarette and took a long drag before turning to her. "Now you belong to us." Those words, heavy with fate, marked the beginning of her new life. The journey down the highway was long and silent. Sofia curled up in the torn leather seat, her eyes fixed on the asphalt disappearing beneath the speeding wheels. The streetlights passed quickly, casting grotesque shadows inside the vehicle. The strong smell of cigarette smoke and sweat filled the air, making each breath difficult. She didn't ask where they were taking her. It didn't matter. Her fate was no longer her choice. Captivity. When they arrived at their destination, she was pushed out of the truck. The place was an old warehouse, with cracked concrete walls and a rusted metal roof. Armed men patrolled the area, their voices echoing through the vast, dark building. Sofia was shoved into a small room with only a filthy mattress on the floor and a dim lamp hanging from the ceiling. The door locked behind her. Silence enveloped her. Time lost meaning inside that room. Days blurred into nights, and the only certainty she had was that no one was coming to rescue her. Her captors barely spoke to her. She received short orders, scarce food, and indifferent glances. Most of them ignored her, treating her as an insignificant nuisance. But even at such a young age, Sofia began to understand that in this dark world, survival required much more than tears and despair. And she would survive. Learning to read danger. The girl started watching. Every detail, every movement, every whispered conversation between the sicarios. She quickly learned who was in charge, who followed orders, and who lied. She listened to the men's stories while washing dishes in the warehouse's kitchen. She knew that mercy didn't exist here, and the weak were discarded without hesitation. She forced herself to remember faces. Names. Who were the soldiers? Who were the bosses? Little by little, she understood that the cartel that had captured her was much bigger than she had imagined. They controlled entire cities, made money from drugs, weapons, and human lives. It was a game of power, and she was just a tiny piece on that board. The first test. One night, she was called to the office of one of the leaders, a tall, thin man with gray hair and eyes as cold as glass. "Do you want to live, girl?" he asked, his deep voice echoing in the closed space. Sofia nodded without hesitation. There was no room for weakness here. "Then learn quickly. The world out there has no mercy on anyone. If you're not useful, you'll be discarded." He slid a knife across the table, staring at her. "Start with small things. Learn to obey. And maybe one day, you'll have something bigger." That night, Sofia held the knife under the dim light of the lamp, feeling the cold metal against her small hand. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never be weak again. The following days were different. From that moment on, She was no longer just a prisoner. They started giving her small tasks. At first, cleaning weapons, organizing boxes, listening to conversations, and delivering messages. She did everything perfectly, knowing that any mistake could cost her life. First lessons in crime. It was Mateo, one of the cartel's most influential men, who noticed her potential. He tested her several times, feeding her false information to see if she would repeat it. But Sofia never failed. Her memory was sharp, and her intelligence even more dangerous. She learned quickly, and by the time she was 9, she already understood that in this game, there were only predators and prey. And she refused to be prey. One night, Mateo took her out of the warehouse. He led her to a black car parked near a cliff. "I need to know how far you're willing to go, girl," he said, opening the trunk. Inside, a gagged man stared at them with terrified eyes. "This son of a bitch betrayed us," Mateo continued, handing her a gun. "Prove that you're not weak." Sofia felt the weight of the revolver in her small hands. Her legs trembled, and her breathing became heavy. But then she looked at the man in the trunk and saw something. Fear. The same fear she had felt the night her family was murdered. She closed her eyes for a second. Then, she opened them again. The gunshot echoed in the silent night. Mateo smiled. "Welcome to the cartel, Sofia." That night, under the starry Mexican sky, a part of her died. And something new was born in its place. The helpless little girl was gone. And in her place, someone emerged who would learn to control her destiny, no matter the price. Chapter 2: Lessons of Blood. Years passed, and Sofia was no longer the helpless girl who cried on cold nights. By the age of 13, she had become a valuable piece within the organization. Her first job was simple: delivering messages, transporting small packages from one place to another. But she was clever. She observed everything, listened to the men's conversations around her, and learned how that world worked. It was Mateo, the shark, who saw her potential. One of the cartel's generals, a man feared and respected. Mateo noticed something in Sofia that others ignored: intelligence, bravery, and an unbreakable will to survive. He decided to train her. The first lesson was brutal. A traitor had been captured. Mateo placed a gun in her hands and ordered her to pull the trigger. Her fingers trembled, and the weapon felt too heavy. But she knew that hesitation meant weakness. And weakness had no place in that world. With one last shaky breath, she pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in her mind for nights on end, but something inside her changed at that moment. She would never tremble again. Learning to kill. Sofia's training wasn't limited to violence. Mateo took her to shooting ranges, taught her to dismantle and assemble weapons, to fight with knives, and to not fear blood. She absorbed everything like a sponge. Every blow she received made her stronger. Every cut made her more resilient. It didn't take long for her to be assigned to more important tasks. Now she participated in negotiations, supervised shipments, and learned the art of intimidation. But her true talent lay in her mind. She knew when to strike and when to wait. She knew how to read people's intentions and anticipate her enemies' moves. The rise. By 16, Sofia was no longer just a trainee. Her name was beginning to earn respect. It was she who uncovered a network of infiltrators within the cartel, men secretly working for a rival group. In a single night, she orchestrated their execution and gained the trust of the leaders. But trust in the cartel was fleeting. There was always someone willing to betray in order to climb the ranks. One night, someone tried to kill her. A hitman infiltrated her room and, with a knife in hand, lunged at her. But Sofia was ready. With a swift movement, She disarmed him and, without hesitation, drove the blade into his neck. Her survival depended on never hesitating. Mateo found her covered in blood, breathing heavily, her eyes as cold as ice. "Now, girl, you're truly one of us," he murmured, proud. A future written in blood. The years inside the cartel had taught her that loyalty was a volatile currency. Sofia was rising, but with power came enemies. She knew that only the strongest survived. Her story had only just begun. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Queen. By the age of 18, Sofia was no longer just another piece in the cartel's game. She had become someone who dictated the rules. Her name began circulating among criminals and authorities, always wrapped in both respect and fear. But her rise would not come without challenges. The power vacuum. Mateo, her mentor and protector, was sick. Years of violence, cigarettes, and alcohol had taken their toll. He trusted Sofia, but he knew that her position in the cartel would not last without a true trial by fire. Many of the older members still saw her as a child, someone who, without Mateo's shadow, would be easily eliminated. The suspicious eyes within the organization did not go unnoticed. Sofia knew that to be recognized, she needed more than just Mateo's loyalty. She needed a victory, a strike that would prove her name deserved to be feared as much as it was respected. The first conflict. Then, an unexpected threat arose. A dissident faction, led by one of Mateo's former lieutenants named Rojas, began challenging the cartel's authority. Small shipments were stolen, informants were killed, and tensions escalated every day. Rojas didn't just want money. He wanted to prove that Sofia was not worthy of command. While the older cartel leaders hesitated, arguing over strategies, Sofia acted. She planned an ambush, striking Rojas at his weakest point. With infiltrated intelligence, she eliminated his guards and found him alone. Without mercy, she ended the rebellion with a single gunshot. The consolidation of respect. Rojas' death solidified her position. The cartel members who once doubted her now saw her as a legitimate leader. The organization needed someone who not only knew how to command, but could also protect its interests with a firm hand and calculated decisions. Mateo, though still ill, smiled as he watched his protégé take control. But he knew his time was running out. Before his death, he called her for one final conversation. "You have everything to be the leader this cartel needs. But never forget, trusting too much is a weakness. Be ruthless when necessary, but always think 10 steps ahead." A few months later, Mateo passed away. His funeral was discreet, but his absence left a void. Sofia, however, did not allow the fragility of the moment to become a problem. On the contrary, she consolidated her power and began expanding operations. Expanding the business. With leadership fully in her hands, Sofia began looking beyond Mexico's borders. The United States was the ultimate prize. Until then, the cartel had intermediaries handling deals with the Americans, but Sofia wanted to cut out the middlemen and gain direct control over distribution. She sent envoys to negotiate with gangs in Los Angeles, Miami, and Chicago. Some accepted, others resisted. For the latter, Sofia sent a clear message: those who were not with her were against her. Alliances strengthened, and profits skyrocketed. But with growth came a new problem: the attention of the authorities. The government's watchful eye. The DEA and FBI began monitoring her operations more closely. Sofia's name appeared in classified reports. Agents were sent to infiltrate her network. But Sofia was careful. She created layers of protection, moved her shipments unpredictably, and paid handsomely to keep local police on her side. But she knew that wouldn't last forever. Meanwhile, inside the cartel itself, new challenges emerged. Some of Mateo's former allies refused to accept that a woman had risen so high. They conspired in secret, waiting for an opportunity to bring her down. Sofia, however, was no fool. She knew the rules of the game well. If her enemies were waiting for a moment of weakness, they were in for an unpleasant surprise. The war for control of the cartel was just beginning. But Sofia was no longer an apprentice. She was the queen, and no one would dare challenge her reign without facing the consequences. Chapter 4: Expansion and Conflicts. Sofia's consolidation of power within the cartel did not come without challenges. With Mateo's death and Rojas' elimination, her dominance was secured internally, but external problems grew exponentially. Expanding into the United States was a risky move, but necessary to sustain the growth of the empire she had inherited. The first major alliance. To secure her entry into the U.S. market, Sofia knew she needed powerful allies. So, she reached out to one of the largest gangs in Los Angeles, the Sons of Fire. They were known for their brutality, but also for their loyalty when the price was right. The negotiation took place in a luxurious mansion in the hills of Tijuana. Sofia, accompanied by her most trusted men, met with Esteban El Lobo Ramirez, the leader of the Sons. At first, the talks were tense. The Americans wanted a bigger cut than Sofia was willing to give. But she knew the game of pressure well. After hours of negotiation, she proposed a deal that benefited both sides: exclusive access to high-quality cocaine at prices lower than their Colombian rivals. El Lobo agreed, but with one condition: a test of loyalty. He wanted Sofia to deliver the head of one of her allies, a trafficker he suspected of betrayal. Without hesitation, Sofia ordered the man's execution before leaving the mansion. The message was clear: she did not hesitate to remove obstacles. The government's watchful eye. As business grew, so did the attention of the authorities. The DEA had already opened case files on her activities, and undercover agents were trying to find a weak spot. In a surprise operation, a shipment was intercepted at the Texas border, resulting in millions of dollars lost and the capture of 3 of her men. Sofia reacted quickly. Using her network of contacts, she ensured that the prisoners remained silent, guaranteeing they were well compensated and that their families were protected. At the same time, she reorganized her routes, making shipments even more unpredictable. Now, her cargo crossed the border through underground tunnels, private vessels, and even small planes landing on clandestine runways in the desert. The first attempted betrayal. With money flowing, internal problems began to escalate. Some of Mateo's old allies were unhappy with her leadership. These were men accustomed to following the orders of a male leader, and despite Sofia's brutality and intelligence, she was still not accepted by everyone. Julio El Toro Contreras, one of the cartel's veterans, began conspiring against her. He secretly organized a meeting with a group of dissenters, planning an ambush to eliminate Sofia and seize control. But Sofia was always one step ahead. One of her infiltrators within the conspiracy alerted her in time. Instead of fleeing, she set her own trap. When Julio and his conspirators made their move, they were met with a coordinated execution. In one night, any trace of resistance was eradicated. Sofia ordered that the bodies of the traitors be scattered along the roads leading to the cartel's stronghold, as a warning to anyone considering the same. Expansion becomes a problem. As her territory expanded, new threats emerged. Rival cartels in Mexico began seeing Sofia as a dangerous enemy. The Jalisco cartel, led by the ruthless Daniel El Diablo Herrera, launched attacks on her warehouses. Explosions, kidnappings, and assassinations became part of daily life. Sofia, however, did not back down. Instead, She responded with twice the violence. She ordered surgical strikes, eliminating Herrera's top commanders. She sent assassins into enemy territory, spreading paranoia and distrust within the Jalisco cartel. The war lasted for months, plunging Mexico into a bloodbath. But in the end, Sofia won. El Diablo was found dead in his home, and his cartel crumbled. Now, the territory was hers. A new challenge. With her enemies eliminated and her operation expanding, Sofia began to enjoy her reign. But, as always, peace was temporary. The DEA intensified its hunt, and new enemies emerged. With every step she took, the danger grew larger. She knew she was at the top, but she also knew that in the world of crime, the top was the hardest place to hold. And her enemies were only waiting for the first opportunity to bring her down. Chapter 5: The Man with Two Faces. The temporary peace that Sofia had conquered did not last long. As her empire strengthened and expanded beyond Mexico's borders, a new danger emerged. It wasn't a rival cartel or internal betrayal. It was something more subtle and far more dangerous, an infiltrated agent. The arrival of Alejandro. Alejandro Calderon appeared in the cartel like a shadow. Intelligent, charismatic, and discreet, he quickly gained the trust of mid-level commanders and began climbing the ranks. His knowledge of logistics and financial operations stood out, and his efficiency was undeniable. What no one knew, yet, was that Alejandro was not a criminal. He was an undercover DEA agent, sent to dismantle Sofia and everything she had built. He studied her every move before even getting close. He knew that Sofia did not trust easily, so he played the long game. He didn't try to impress her at first, but subtly made himself indispensable to the operations. The game of trust. What Alejandro didn't expect was that the very nature of the world he had infiltrated would begin to affect him. At first, it was just a role he played to fulfill his mission. But with each conversation with Sofia, with every glance they exchanged, something inside him began to shift. He found himself admiring her intelligence, her cold determination, and, above all, her ability to lead in a world dominated by men. And, against all odds, Sofia began to notice Alejandro as well. She wasn't naive, but she saw something different in him. He was calculating, but he didn't try to flatter her like the others. He was efficient, but he never sought to stand out more than necessary. That intrigued her. Their relationship began discreetly. At first, as allies who relied on each other for the safety of their operations. Then, as friends who shared words in moments of silence. Until, inevitably, they became something more. The beginning of the romance. The first time they kissed was on a quiet night, in a secure cartel hideout, after a long and exhausting meeting. It was a brief, almost accidental moment. But from then on, something changed. Alejandro knew he was crossing a line with no return. If the DEA discovered he had become emotionally involved with Sofia, his mission would be compromised. But he couldn't stop himself. And Sofia, despite everything, couldn't either. Their relationship escalated quickly. In the few moments they had away from business, they were together. They shared conversations neither would have with anyone else. But the weight of Alejandro's deception loomed over him. He knew that sooner or later, Sofia would discover who he really was. The DEA investigation. Meanwhile, across the border, the DEA closely monitored Sofia's every move. Confidential reports, intercepted calls, and financial transactions pointed to something unexpected. Sofia was expanding her operations in a more organized and secure way than any leader before her. This made the authorities' job more difficult. They needed a weakness. And Alejandro was that weakness. The plan was simple. He had to gather enough evidence to enable a massive operation that would bring down Sofia's cartel once and for all. But with each passing day, following that plan became harder. The moment of revelation. The truth came out in the worst possible way. Sofia had already started suspecting something. She had always been a natural strategist, and no matter how much she trusted Alejandro, she never ignored her intuition. She began testing him, watching small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Until one night, she found documents in his possession that shouldn't have been there. Files, notes, names. Everything indicated that Alejandro had been collecting information for someone, and she knew exactly for whom. When Alejandro returned to the hideout that night, he found Sofia waiting for him, a gun on the table. "Who are you really, Alejandro?" Her voice was cold, but her eyes revealed something deeper, pain. He knew there was no way to lie now. "I'm a DEA agent, Sofia, and I was sent to bring you down." The silence that followed was deafening. Sofia could have shot him right then. He knew that, but she didn't. The internal conflict. Sofia felt a deep rage consume her, not just because of the betrayal, but because of the cruel irony of it all. She, who had never trusted anyone, had let her guard down for an enemy. But at the same time, something inside her refused to pull the trigger. "So it was all a lie?" she asked, her voice heavy with resentment. "At first, yes," Alejandro admitted. "But after, I don't even know what was real and what was just the mission anymore." She narrowed her eyes, trying to decipher whether there was sincerity in his words. Everything inside her told her she should kill him. But what she felt for him did not disappear in that moment. "Leave," she finally said, "before I change my mind." Alejandro hesitated, but he knew this was his only chance. Without saying another word, he walked out the door, disappearing into the night. Sofia stood there, alone, feeling vulnerable for the first time in a long time. She knew that, somehow, this story was not over yet, and that the war between them had only just begun. Chapter 6: Love and Betrayal. The silence that followed Alejandro's departure felt like a sentence. Sofia knew the truth had been revealed, and from now on, nothing would ever be the same. Her heart was torn between the pain of betrayal and the love she had, against all odds, come to feel for this man. But there was no time for weakness. If Alejandro was still loyal to the DEA, everything she had fought for was at risk. The hunt begins. That same night, Sofia gathered her most trusted men. She knew Alejandro couldn't simply disappear. She had to find him before he had the chance to hand over any information. Her first instinct was to check known hideouts, but it was obvious that Alejandro, as intelligent as he was, wouldn't make it easy. The search began across her properties. She ordered every warehouse, safe house, and meeting point to be inspected. But he had already vanished without a trace. The only clue she found was a contact Alejandro had with a DEA informant weeks earlier. That confirmed what she had already suspected. He had been there with a purpose from the very beginning. The infiltrator within the cartel. As she dealt with the pain of Alejandro's betrayal, a new problem arose. Sofia started noticing unusual movements within the cartel. Someone from the inside was leaking information to the DEA, and now that Alejandro had been exposed, he was not the only threat. The suspicion that another infiltrator was still operating within her ranks forced her to intensify her investigations. She interrogated her lieutenants, reviewed records, and cross-checked information. Sofia knew that if she didn't eliminate this threat quickly, she would be vulnerable to a coordinated attack from the authorities. Any member who showed even the slightest doubt was subjected to lethal tests. Loyalty was everything in this world, and there was no room for uncertainty. The return of Alejandro. After days of an intense search, Alejandro reappeared unexpectedly. He wasn't captured or found by her men. He returned on his own. Instead of running and seeking refuge, he presented himself directly to the woman he had vowed to take down. "You can kill me, Sofia. I know I deserve it," he said, making no attempt to escape. She stared at him, gun in hand and heart in conflict. Her instincts screamed for her to pull the trigger, but something inside her made her hesitate. "Why? Why did you come back?" Her voice carried emotion, but her expression remained firm. "Because I can't go through with this mission. Not after what I feel for you. The DEA wants to take you down, but I can't be part of this anymore," he admitted. Sofia studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. But Alejandro stood there, vulnerable, unarmed, with no plans. Just him and the truth. A dangerous agreement. Sofia took a deep breath. She could end everything right then, but an idea crossed her mind. What if, instead of killing him, she used him to her advantage? What if he became the key to a much bigger plan? "Then prove it," she said, lowering her gun. "If you're really on my side, we're going to destroy every cartel, every route, the entire structure that exists. But we do it together, on my terms." Alejandro hesitated. He knew this meant betraying his mission, betraying his loyalty to the DEA. But at this point, he had no loyalties left. Only Sofia. "I'm with you," he replied, without the slightest doubt. The new strategy. Now together, but always walking on a minefield, Sofia and Alejandro began to design their plan. They would use the DEA's intelligence to dismantle rival cartels. They would create a web of false information to confuse authorities while eliminating their enemies from within. But the tension was inevitable. Sofia still doubted him, and Alejandro knew he could be tested at any moment. Their love was real, but trust was a difficult currency to maintain in such a dangerous game. The first strike. The first attack was against a rival cartel that operated in alliance with corrupt officials. Sofia and Alejandro used their influence and connections within the DEA to dismantle an entire operation. It was a calculated move. They appeared as allies of the authorities while eliminating their competition. The strike was a success. But it also meant they were now being watched more closely. Both the DEA and enemy cartels wanted answers, and any mistake could cost them everything. Love and distrust. Despite being on the same side, Sofia kept Alejandro under constant surveillance. Her feelings for him were strong, but she couldn't ignore the fact that he was a man trained to deceive. If he had any hidden agenda, she would find out. And if he ever became a threat, she would kill him without hesitation. Alejandro knew this. He knew his life hung by a thread, but he accepted the risks. Because, at the end of the day, he had long since crossed the line. And Sofia, though she wouldn't admit it, could no longer imagine her war without him by her side. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. Sofia and Alejandro's plan was in motion. They had infiltrated the corridors of power, manipulating information and eliminating strategic threats, but now the noose was tightening. Rival cartels were reacting, and the DEA was increasing pressure on Alejandro, suspecting his loyalty. Time was running out. Pressure from the DEA. Every week, Alejandro received coded messages from the DEA demanding updates. His superiors were growing restless, suspicious of his hesitation to provide details on Sofia. He knew his time as a double agent wouldn't last much longer. In a secret meeting, one of his government contacts confronted him. "We need something big, Alejandro. If we don't have solid proof to take down Sofia's cartel within a month, you'll be compromised." The DEA agent looked him straight in the eyes. "We're starting to doubt your loyalty." Alejandro nodded, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't betray Sofia. He needed an alternative. He had to secure a future for both of them. The final plan. Sofia had already foreseen this situation. With Alejandro under surveillance, she began crafting a risky move, giving up the drug empire and dismantling the cartels, but remaining free. The goal was simple: to become untouchable. She gathered her closest allies in a secret meeting and laid out her proposal. "We're going to give it all up, but on our terms. If we do this right, we'll escape with our lives and enough power to make sure no one ever comes after us again." Her eyes scanned the faces around the table. Some were shocked, while others understood the plan immediately. Sofia wanted to negotiate with the authorities, take down her rivals, launder her money, and reinvent herself. But to pull it off, they needed Alejandro. "Can you make this happen?" she asked, looking directly at him. Alejandro took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, but it will be dangerous. If anything goes wrong, we're dead." Sofia smirked slightly. "When haven't we been?" The first move. The first step was to hand over an entire shipment belonging to a rival cartel directly to the DEA. Using secret routes, Sofia and Alejandro made it appear as though their competitors were responsible for leaking information. The operation was a success. Within days, one of Mexico's most powerful cartels was dismantled. But that also had consequences. Chaos erupted in the criminal underworld, and Sofia knew there was now a price on her head. She and Alejandro needed to move fast. The final play. The last piece of the plan was the hardest. Alejandro had to convince the DEA that Sofia was cooperating. In a clandestine meeting with his superiors, he presented evidence that the criminal empire was collapsing from within. "If you want to shut this down without an all-out war, give me guarantees. Sofia wants out of this alive. And so do I." Alejandro kept his composure, but his heart pounded in his chest. The DEA chief eyed him with suspicion. "And why should we trust you?" Alejandro slid an envelope across the table. "Because we've already taken down 3 operations. And we can give you the last one. But if you try to betray us, we'll disappear. Forever." Silence filled the room. Finally, the DEA agent sighed and nodded. "Deal. But if anything goes wrong, you'll have nowhere to run." The last goodbye. That night, Sofia and Alejandro met on a rooftop, overlooking the city lights below. The war was coming to an end. They were about to become ghosts, to disappear from the world they had built and start something new. "Do you still trust me?" Alejandro asked. Sofia gently cupped his face, looking into his eyes. "No, but I love you, and that's enough." They kissed, knowing that by dawn, a new life awaited them. But their story was far from over. Chapter 8: Rebirth in Chaos. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon as Sofia and Alejandro left behind the city they once ruled. The pact with the DEA was sealed, but the risk remained immense. No cartel fell without resistance, and the consequences of their actions would soon ripple through the underworld of crime. The dangerous escape. They knew they couldn't just disappear without raising suspicion. Sofia orchestrated her own death. In a carefully planned explosion at one of her hideouts, unidentifiable bodies were placed to confuse identification. The news spread quickly. The feared cartel leader was dead. Meanwhile, Alejandro used his contacts in the DEA to secure new identities. The government was willing to uphold its part of the deal, but only if Sofia and Alejandro vanished completely off the radar. Now, they were ghosts, officially dead to the world. The cartel's counterattack. The fall of Sofia's cartel created a power vacuum. Rival factions began brutally fighting for control of drug trafficking routes. Executions became frequent, and Mexico plunged into even greater chaos. Some of Sofia's former allies, believing she had betrayed them, swore revenge. The Jalisco cartel, one of the most powerful, refused to accept the narrative of Sofia's death so easily. They wanted proof. They wanted blood. The hideout and the paranoia. Sofia and Alejandro temporarily settled in Argentina, far from the shadows of their past. But even in their new home, paranoia never left them. They constantly changed houses, avoided predictable routines. They knew that if they were found, there would be no second chance. Alejandro tried to convince her that they could now live in peace, but Sofia couldn't simply erase the years of war she had fought. She continued to maintain informants on the streets of Mexico, monitoring every movement. That's how she learned that an assassin was on their trail. The final confrontation. One of Sofia's former hitmen, Ignacio El Silencio, a man of few words and lethal hands, discovered that his former boss was still alive. Driven by revenge and a desire to restore the cartel's honor, he followed their tracks to Buenos Aires. The attack happened in a discreet cafe. Alejandro spotted Ignacio's approach too late. The first shot grazed Sofia's arm, and then everything turned into chaos. Alejandro reacted quickly, drew his gun, and fired at the attacker. The fight was short, brutal. Ignacio collapsed to the ground, lifeless. But that attack meant only one thing: they would never truly be safe. An uncertain future. Sofia knew that as long as she was alive, there would always be someone willing to find her. She and Alejandro could keep running forever, changing names, changing countries, trying to leave behind the weight of their crimes. But she also knew that wasn't how her story was meant to end. "We can keep running," Alejandro said as he drove toward a new hideout. "Or we can end this once and for all." Sofia looked out the window, watching the city blur past. "I don't want to run anymore," she answered with determination. "But if we fight, it will be on our terms." They knew they only had two options: hide forever or return and eliminate every last remaining threat. And Sofia had never been one to hide. Alejandro tightened his grip on the steering wheel, understanding her decision. They had escaped death before. And now, they were about to do it once again. The world still believed Sofia was dead. But she was only waiting for the right moment to be reborn.